Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to welcome you to tonight's event with Helene Wecker discussing her latest book, The Hidden Palace, a novice of the Golem and the Jinni. She is joined tonight in conversation by Angela Mi Young Hur. Through good times and bad, Harvard Bookstore will continue to bring authors and their work to our virtual community. We have an amazing summer season. It's in full swing. So make sure to check out our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk tonight, go to the Q&A button on your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you'd like to purchase a copy of The Hidden Palace, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link will support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Without your continued support and patronage, this virtual author series wouldn't be possible. Thank you so much for tuning in support of our authors, our incredible booksellers, and our landmark independent bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support, especially now. And as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. Thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Zoom now offers CC options. If you would like closed captioning, click on the CC button wherever it may live on your screen. Now, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Helene Wecker is the author of The Golem and the Jinni, which was awarded the Mayo Poetic Award for Adult Literature, the VCU Cabell Award for First Novel, and the Harold U. Ribolo Prize, which was also nominated for a Nebula Award and a World Fantasy Award. Her work has appeared in literary journals such as Joyland and Catamaran, as well as the fantasy anthology The Jinn Falls in Love and Other Stories. She is joined by Angela Mi Young Hur. Angela is the author of Folklorn. She has worked as a staff editor for the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and is the recipient of a Sparks Fellowship and Sparks Prize, a postgraduate fellowship. Folklorn was chosen for a Tin House novel mentorship through the Tin House Summer Workshop, where Angela studied with authors such as Alexander Chee and Kelly Link. Tonight, they are discussing The Hidden Palace. This is the brilliant, long-awaited sequel to The Golem and the Jinni. It continues the story of Hava, a golem, and a woman made of clay who can hear the thoughts and longings of those around her and feels compelled by her nature to help them. And Ahmed, a genie, once free to roam the desert, but now imprisoned in the shape of a man. I'll leave you with this quote from Bookpage. Fans of The Golem and the Jinni have waited 8 years for this sequel, a minor eternity perfectly in keeping with the precarious immortality of Wecker's hopeful monsters. It has been worth the wait. And on that note of praise, I'll turn things over to our authors. Helene, Angela, thank you so much for joining us tonight. The virtual stage is yours.
Hi, thank you so much, Audrey. Thank you, Helene. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Oh, me too. Thank you.
Yes, I devoured your books this past week, so I've been fully immersed. I finished the first book, The Golem and the Jinni, in one night, very late, maybe around midnight, and I went ahead and started the next book, The Hidden Palace. And so I'm bursting with questions. But before that, welcome everyone for joining us for the Zoom event. And first, we get to hear Helene read part from her novel.
So I should maybe just say a little bit about what part this is, where we are. So Hava, our woman made of clay, and Ahmad, our genie, have reunited after the events of the first book. And so they are sort of getting to know each other again. And one of the things that they do together, since neither of them sleep, is they walk around New York together. It takes place in New York around the turn of the 20th century. In 1900, this part is. So that's just a little bit of background. So here we go. At last, the first true freeze of winter arrived, and Central Park gave itself to the cold and snow. The vining roses were pruned back to a handful of canes. The elms on the mall grasped the sky with empty fingers. I'm sorry, the golem said one night as they neared the Harlem Mere. This will be a long walk back, and it's starting to snow again. Stop worrying about me, said the genie, and stop apologizing. I can't help it. It feels like I'm putting you at risk. You aren't asking me to jump in a river, Hava. I can manage a little snow. She sighed. It's just louder now, or it feels louder. Oh, it's hard to explain. She hugged herself as she walked, clearly miserable. With the onset of winter, her clay body had grown stiff and uncomfortable, an expected effect and manageable as long as she walked often enough. But now, like arthritic joints that ached with the rain, the scream in her mind, her trapped creator in his endless anger, had grown sharper, more distracting. She'd begun to make careless mistakes at the bakery, such as forgetting the raisins in the challah dough, or doubling the baking powder in the cookies so that they swelled as large as biscuits. Thea Radzin thought it a lingering effect of her widowhood. With each mishap, she cast a pitying look at her favorite employee, thinking, and who could blame the girl if she came unhinged? Do you think I'm coming unhinged? The golem asked suddenly. Do I think what? That I'm coming unhinged. It's what Thea thinks, though of course she doesn't say it. And no, she doesn't understand, but you do. So you must tell me, please. He blew out an impatient and unnecessary breath. Chava, you aren't coming unhinged, whatever that means. The winters are difficult for you. We knew this. It's all of a piece. And you're handling it far better than I would were I to hear that man screaming in my head all the time. You make it sound like he's hurling curses at me, she muttered. It's simpler than that, like a tinnitus, I suppose, just louder lately. Better hear, though? She gazed about at the dark tableau of the park, feeling with her distant senses the earth below them, its warmth banked and waiting. The seasons would turn, she reminded herself. Her body would lose its stiffness and unease, and her mind would quiet once more. Yes, she said, better here. Spring arrived as promised. The rains began, forcing them apart and indoors, she sewing in her room each night, he working in the shop. Without him, she grew restless. Her mind strayed toward the couples who hurried by outside, laughing beneath their umbrellas, their thoughts full of what might happen when they reached their warm apartments, their inviting beds. He, too, became tense and distractible, full of unsettled longings, uncertain of their welcome. He, who'd once sauntered up Fifth Avenue so confidently in search of Sophia Winston's mansion. And she, meanwhile, reviewed every conversation they'd ever had upon the subject of faithfulness, his opinions ringing in her mind like a punishment. Humans and their ridiculous rules. But she also recalled something that had happened before the rains had separated them, a night when they'd passed a Lower East Side synagogue just as two women, clear at a glance as mother and daughter, emerged from its basement stairwell. The daughter's hair had hung down her back in damp coils. She'd shivered in the night air, nervous and excited, her pale face glowing. The older woman had put a comforting arm around her, and they'd hurried down the street together, mother whispering to daughter, the daughter nodding. It's late for a bath, isn't it? The genie had said as they disappeared. It's a mikveh, a ritual bath, she told him. And then, at his confusion, by Jewish law, a woman mustn't lie with her husband during her menses. Once it's ended, she immerses herself in the mikveh and recites a blessing. Brides do it, too, before the wedding ceremony. Ah, and the younger one? She marries in the morning. She'd waited for him to call it absurd or superstitious or any of his other usual complaints, but he'd only nodded as though half listening, his expression entirely opaque. Perhaps, she thought at her window, watching the rain. Perhaps. At last the rain ended. That night he arrived at her boarding house at their usual hour, and they walked north together in a charged silence. He could feel the barely perceptible mist that she always carried about herself, like the lightest touch upon his skin. And she wondered, had he always been so warm at her side, a heat that she could feel from an arm's length away? They entered the park and walked through the ramble, quiet and alone, making only the most inconsequential of comments. I've never noticed that path before. Look, the hillside's washed away. They followed the gill to where it calmed and widened, and the genie wondered why, for what felt like the first time in his hundreds of years, he found it impossible merely to say what he wanted. I'd expected the river to be higher after so much rain, he said instead, helpless, cursing himself. It's controlled by an aqueduct, she told him, so the rain doesn't affect it. Oh, he said, nonplussed. I'd assumed it was real and they built the park around it. She smiled at this. Of course it's real, she said. And then, before he could protest, you know what I mean. Here, I'll show you. She unclasped her cloak, letting it fall to her feet. He nearly asked what she was doing, but lost his voice in surprise as her shirtwaist and skirt followed the cloak, and then shoes and stockings too. Not once did she glance his way, only calmly rid herself of clothing, then walked down the bank and into the current, disappearing beneath the water. For long moments he was alone. Dumbfounded, he glanced at the clothing that lay on the bank as though to reassure himself that he hadn't imagined it all. And then the gill rippled as her head broke the surface. She emerged onto the bank, water running from her skin in rivulets as she came to stand before him. She didn't smile, but her eyes were alight. Her expression was one of challenge and expectation. He raised a hand, traced a finger along the edge of her cheek. The clinging droplets vanished into steam. "What would you ask of me, Chava?" he said quietly. "A promise," she told him, "that you will have only me." He realized he'd expected this. What surprised him was his willingness. "And you'd promise the same?" "Yes," a whisper. "Then I will have only you," he said. "And I will have only you," she replied. They smiled at each other then, tentative, wondering at what they'd done. He took her hands, they were freezing cold, and drew her closer. Go.
That was fantastic. So beautiful. Thank you. That reading triggers for me a couple questions. First of all, I was really struck by how expansive and immersive this book is. And I think partly what was striking about it is that New York is the perfect setting for a story about these immigrants and these supernatural immigrants who come here together, because New York is a vertical city. And so a lot of times you have these ethnic enclaves, these communities be stacked on top of each other. So they might only be a few blocks, but there's a whole world within. And I thought it was fascinating how these characters, they live in their different neighborhoods, and sometimes they overlap, sometimes they intersect. And it seems like the borders, people are quite aware, and they're quite aware of these neighborhoods, even if it seems static. But then there's also this one scene where someone notes that there used to be German signage and it's very faint, but now another community has taken over. So there's that setting, the sort of, it's almost like kind of reminds me of Brigadoon, how you can pass a street and not realize that there's this whole world there hidden. So I love how you bring in this that's rooted very much in the history of turn of the century New York with immigrant history, but also has this supernatural aspect with the Golem and the Jinni. And specifically, I think what really made this so immersive for me was that instead of like a removed omniscient narrator, who with this kind of emotional remove, just in a very classic style, omnisciently narrates everything, we have a close third, mostly with the main characters, but then sometimes like a roving camera sort of swoops into these side characters. And of course, you're able to utilize Chava being able to hear and listen to other people's thoughts. And it really creates this richly textured world where even characters who might seem minor, we get a glimpse into their desires and hopes and desperations. Of course, is something that's very overwhelming to her. And it echoes how she can peer into all these minds. And so we get from an expanse where across generations, across communities, and it really just creates something that's epic, but at the same time intimate. I was wondering how was this your design from the very beginning? Did you experiment with other POVs? And what were sort of stumbling blocks or opportunities?
Let's see, from the very beginning. Okay, so my like Achilles heel is first person. I can't do first person. I've never been able to like write in first person. It's something I want to tackle someday. It just feel like it's like Zoolander, only being able to turn in one direction. But I knew that I wanted it to be New York. As soon as like I'd sort of come up with the idea for what it was that I wanted to do with these characters, I knew it wanted to be New York, and it felt like the turn of the 20th century. And that is literally, as far as my thinking at the time went, it was, oh, here's a couple of characters. I think I'll put them in New York at the turn of the 20th century. I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And so everything that sort of fell out from there was trial and error. I thought I was writing a short story. This was back when I was at Columbia. So I was getting my MFA, and I was like trying desperately to ignore the fact that my that my dissertation process wasn't going well, that these like very real realistic short stories I was writing just weren't working very well, and so this was something that a friend had suggested, like try some fantasy to break it up. And so I started this and I thought it was going to be a short story. And as I wrote, like at first it was the sort of thing where a year passes in like a few pages. I thought because it was much more of like a higher level voice of there, like you said, the distant, omniscient fairy tale sort of uh, third person. And then what my workshop mates told me was, we want to see the details. We want to see how they're doing it. You've got these two characters who are living, who are like immigrating and living in New York. And what does that look like day to day? That's where like the fun stuff is like watching them like try to interact with the city and go, okay, what is a job and why do I need one? Instead of just they ended up here and then they did this for a couple of years and then they did something else. So at that point was when I like slowed down and I went back and I like filled in the pages that I'd already written with detail. And I had to do a ton of research because I knew next to nothing. And that was part of the reason why I think looking back at it afterwards, I was like, oh, that's why I elided everything, was because I had no idea what the hell I was talking about. So there's that like instinct to like, oh, I'll just pull back. And it's like, well, yeah, because I don't know what I'm doing. So once I got a little more under my belt in the research, then I could really start to fill in. And then it was a question of, okay, now I'm doing the research. I'm putting too much in. And so again, it was like trial and error and having to go back and also just figuring out the rules for how in my particular version, what is a genie? How does, what's his, kryptonite? What are the rules of what he can and can't do? The same with Chava. I wrote like almost a whole version. I think it was like 2 or 3 years into writing it before I put in her empathic abilities. So I had to like go all the way back and to the beginning and start again and add all of that in, because at that point it's like, okay, any given scene, who is she in a room with? What are they thinking? Is that something that she's going to be able to take in and use? Or is that just something she's going to ignore? I can't now put her in a room with anyone who knows something she shouldn't know for plot purposes. So it became like a logic puzzle in some ways of like, okay, how am I going to, work this through the story and not have her like know everything, have her like learn things as she goes. So yeah, to answer your larger question, it really was all just trial and error and a lot of false starts and a lot of dead ends.
Right. Well, it's fascinating to hear that her empathic ability came later on in the process, because I feel that it's so much intertwined with who she is, and also the playing with the magic. There has to be limitation, because they can't be superpowered heroes who can just do everything. Also, her limitation, the fact that she can't peer into Ahmad's thoughts, really gives them the catalyst for getting to know each other, of course. There has to be, he becomes her refuge, a place where she can just get to know each other, and not having to peer into anyone's deep secrets. But through that, like in the scene that you just read, there's a lot of friction there, an opportunity for misunderstanding, but also the sort of provides that gap necessary for these two creatures who already feel so separate from mere mortals, for them to try to reach towards each other and bridge towards each other.
Yeah.
That also reminds me that in the book, you also play with language. Like I never really considered until the Hidden Palace how the Ahmad as the genie is really the one who is in exile. And kind of his experience really resonates with the immigrant experience of my parents and myself, because he actually has a past. Whereas the Golem is someone who is brand new, newly created. And so she's not quite dealing with the loss that the genie does. And he brings up with language, not being able to speak his genie language with anyone. And you play with so many things about how they notice that their English idioms like slip into their everyday language too. And Yeah, I thought it provided so much beautiful friction, because in the first book we have these characters growing towards each other, even through a lot of argument, but they're also forming their own identities. And then I wondered what would the author do for the sequel when they are together, and that scene that you read. And I don't want to give away too much, but general shape, it's how do these people continue to grow? And if they
Mhm.
can't grow together, how do they grow as individuals? And I found that what was so wonderful is that your focus on the tactility of their arts. And you mentioned about the texture, right? And doing all the research. We have from the first book, we have the Jinni doing tinsmithery and then making jewelry. So he's like growing towards an artist. And then we have Hava, who is a baker. And as a golem, she is someone who's a nurturer. And you play with, like, gender roles there too. And
Mhm.
she becomes, she finds another career path. I was curious that as their talents become bigger and their ambitions become bigger too, which of these sort of career paths or crafts, artisanal sort of paths, did you enjoy most researching? Or which of these sort of craftsmanship sort of artistries did you find most resonant with your own process in writing?
Oh gosh, wow, those are good questions. I really, really enjoyed researching the golems, Hava's the career path that she ends up taking. Just I'll try not to give too much away, but she goes to school. She's never been to school, and she gets a degree in domestic sciences, which is basically home ec on turn of the century steroids. It's the at the time they were people were starting to codify like things like cooking and hygiene and like the home arts, the home sciences, and they were making it into there is now a right and a wrong way to do this, and it was all very science based, and it was like turning the kitchen into a laboratory, and it was, on the one hand, you know you learn more about things like, okay, this is why you can't leave the hollandaise out at room temperature for 5 hours and then eat it. And on the other hand, it was, well, we don't, these are people, they started to look at like old world cooking as, well, that's like, ignorant, and you can't just learn cooking from your mother anymore. That's what the peasants do. You must learn the way that the scientists teach it, and so on. So it was like, now there's a right and a wrong way to be a cook and a woman, because of that. But uh, I managed to find online a bunch of the old teachers college materials for, like, this course actually existed, like that she took in the book, and it was fun just to read through them, and to be, with the hindsight of history, and looking at the very high-minded language that they were using to talk about, to elevate and make elite something like washing a dang floor, like it was the begin. I've always been fascinated by like the commodification of femininity, and the very 1950s sort of, like, when you look at Good Housekeeping, and their instructions for how to wash a blanket run for 2 pages, and it's like we are inventing this work to make women feel like they are doing something, and not just wanting to go out and do something else. So that all very much sort of lined up with my interests. Yeah. All the metalsmithing stuff terrified me. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to get everything wrong, and the engineers are going to send emails. And, I ended up, my husband's a physicist, so I put some of it past him. And then there's some stuff later in the book that's structural engineering. And my dad was an engineer, and my brother's an engineer, and every man in my family is either a physicist or an engineer. So I luckily had a number of people I could put it past and say, okay, does this make you want to, like, email me and yell at me? And they said, no. I said, thank you, we're good. Sending it to the publisher. So that was that was how I ended up doing that.
It's interesting because you talk about the technical aspect of it, and clearly you did so much research that you are an academic mind, but when Ahmed talks about the architecture and the engineering, it's quite beautiful. Like I see it more as an artistic creation with the sculpture. So I just find it interesting that you talking about it from the from the position of precision and scientific accuracy, rather than, I mean, even the way Chava talks about with the baking, and then with going to the teacher's college, like there is that scientific rigor, but I mean, she is also someone who is so, I don't know, because of her empathetic nature and because of her ability, she's able to really nurture, of course. And that kind of plays along with the gender roles that you're examining. I did
Yeah,
have a question about.
I feel like, I think that sort of comes about from what I said before about like growing up in this household that was very, science-based and very, valued learning and academics. And I think, I want it to be believable. I always hate it when like some detail pulls me out of a book or something because I'm like, well, wait, it doesn't work like that. And so, I read way too much science fiction and way too much, I've like way too much respect for like science basically to not want to get it right. But what moves me is like how that intersects with our emotions and our, just our lives in general, and like get that there is a beauty in that precision that you can that if you can bring it out is like something that I really appreciate.
Yeah, and it dovetails so well with their characters too, and even their elemental beings, with one of the earth and water and the other of fire. I thought that was just brilliantly done. You touched upon that you were, it's historical fiction, so you're examining sort of the gender roles, gender expectations, which would be specific to the time, but also to their class and their different communities. And I thought it was so cool how in the first book, you is a female golem, which I hadn't heard of before.
Mhm.
So you're playing with the myth of the golem as a protector, but we have one who is so advanced here, but who still has the instinct of wanting to protect the community, and to also, like women then and a lot of women now, feel the pressure, the need to belong, to fit in, to be likable, to be helpful, and how that contrasts with the Jinni, who gets to exult in sort of this very male privilege of being selfish and impulsive and following his desires. And that also interlaces with the research you did into the Jinni lore. So I was quite intrigued how you further play with these gender roles in the new book, Hidden Palace, by introducing a Jinni, a female
Mhm.
Jinni, and then also Yasala, a golem who is closer to the traditional sort of golem of being kind of like this huge lumbering creature of clay
Mhm. Big
with,
hulking, yeah.
yeah, with someone who's just toiling into and only exists for the master. But I want the readers, of course, to analyze for themselves, but I was curious how much you could share with us of what was interesting for you or surprising as you did another like gender flip. These
Oh,
characters.
wow. Oh gosh. Wow, that is interesting question. The stuff with Yasala, who's the big sort of hulking silent golem, he um the the interesting gender stuff about him is that how nurturing he is.
Mm-hmm.
Um that he is, yeah, like you said, he is there for his master, who is little girl named Grindel. Um and he's her protector, but also her sole companion, because something happens to her that she ends up basically having to uh, live in an orphanage, and he is the only person there. He's hidden in the basement, and she knows he's there, but no one else knows, and so he's her secret and her like only companion. And he, in as much as he can, he knows this, and he cherishes her. And it's not just like she says something and he has to do it. There is absolutely that aspect, but he has just enough self-awareness to love her too, and to feel a lot of sympathy, and be upset for her when her, because she's living a pretty sad existence at this orphanage. Um, and I tried to play that up as much as I could, while also like having him be the very, like, male presenting male, uh, he's built to protect and to be brutish. Um, and for the Genia, she was fun. She was fun to play with. She's amoral, basically, or at least acts, especially at the beginning, in a very amoral fashion. She's very much out for herself. She wants what she wants, and she's going to get it. And then to have her slammed into this situation where suddenly she has to be around these humans who she hates, that and to negotiate with another human woman named Sophia, that made and Sophia, I mean, Sophia is a little unusual too. So the two of them, like, they're very prickly with each other, but they're a good pair.
Mutual respect too, in a way. I think there's like a kinship.
Yes, yes. There's a lot of parallels between the two of them. So even as much as they resent sort of being stuck with each other, they do. It's again that sort of understanding of what the other is going through. I had an earlier version where Dima came over a lot earlier in the story, and there's a lot of her like learning to be human in New York, and none of it really worked well because it was all just Dima being confined and constrained and angry about it. And which is fine for a couple of pages, but that goes on for too long, and it's just like, oh, like it just felt like I was sort of torturing her for no reason. It felt like I'd taken this really cool character and just put her in a cage and didn't let her do her thing.
Right.
And so that was, I was like, ugh, and I ended up just rewriting a whole bunch of that and taking it all out. But that when she and Ahmad meet, I think it become one of the things that is so compelling for him is that she has none of the constraints. She has none of the female, societal constraints that certainly that Hava did, because she was mirroring the people around her, and just that the humans do. And that was like, I think it sort of blows him back a bit. And he's like, oh, right, that's how we're supposed to be. And so that was fun to play with.
Yeah, there's also the shared language,
Mm-hmm.
and how that unlocks for him certain sensations.
Mm-hmm.
And that moment, of course, for those who ship Hava and Ahmad, it can seem kind of threatening. But without giving too much away, you do play a lot with that. Like, is it an illusion of kinship between them too at times?
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it was interesting to have these characters who come from such different communities, but also they're from totally different creatures. And having this, the friction between them is actually how they grow, and they hear each other's voices when you know someone so intimately. So I feel like there's all these ways that you play with the idea of, is language a barrier, or is language kind of gives you an illusion of sort of that you are speaking in shorthand, for example. Or for personal example, there was I'm married to a Swede, and I mean, now he just sounds like an American, but when we were first courting, speaking English, that there was some kind, even though he speaks fluently, he wrote his dissertation in English, he grew up in Sweden, and there were some people who were skeptical about us not sharing a native language. But what I realized is that we had to be a lot more careful trying to communicate and express ourselves, instead of relying on sort of stock relationship fight lines, or or just
Yeah.
or you just assume that you know, through idiom or whatever, that you already understand each other. And so I found that there's so much in the first book and the second book where there is intellectual philosophical debate between the two lovers, and that's really how they're able to form their own minds, but also, you know, through that conflict, really get to know each other as well. There are other places where there is like you play with, there's a shared language that can kind of suppose a possible commune, but it's actually not. But there's also a lot of shared consciousness in the book with a lot of mind reading. And that for me was much more playing with these sort of mind swapping or mind union tropes that I see in sci-fi fantasy. And I saw that you were really enjoying playing with that. But it wasn't just for the cool effect. What I found also moving were that contrasting with characters who there were no way that they could know each other. And you have Toby and Anna, the two mortals, and the mother and son, and the mother trying to, you know, protect the son from this other reality, and her not knowing all this time what's going on in him. And then also playing with consciousness with Yasala. I thought so fascinating how you chart the development of his awareness and self-awareness too. My question for you then would be, how did you choose, let's see, for the sake of drama and getting to know characters, did you play with choosing which characters would be able to unite their minds and understand each other immediately versus who would be more separate? Did you sort of switch them around, or was it always clear that of course the mother and son would have this barrier, and then, you know, Sophia and Jinni?
I think Toby and Anna, I knew from the beginning were just going to be at odds, because they'd had such different experiences of this sort of other world, these other creatures that Anna is now trying to hide from him, and he knows are out there because his mother's life just doesn't make sense to him, and his history doesn't make sense to him, and so he knows there's something out there, and he's also having nightmares, and so they like are the two, like you said, they live the most intimately together, but they are the farthest apart from each other, and just that how little they share of their innermost selves with each other. But for let's see, for Dima and Sophia, oh gosh, a lot of it was like, you're asking how did I decide who to pair, who to get into each other's mind. Some of it is like for purposes of the plot, it's like, okay, Dima and Sophia, you see Dima going through, you see Dima and her whole struggle and how she gets exiled from her tribe of Jinn. And you see Sophia in the Middle East, and they're sort of for a few hundred pages, they're slowly making their way toward each other. And then I was like, okay, now these two are going to get together and they're going to need something from each other, and they're not going to, how are we going to, is it going to be like pages of them just sitting telling each other their stories? No, we need to like speed this up. And I knew that I wanted to get it off to a rocky start. I didn't want these two to like each other at the very beginning. So I knew that, Dima, being the amoral creature she is, would have absolutely no problem just entering Sophia's mind and digging around and seeing what was there. So that was how that came about. And it ended up being a pretty good way of like economically having them get to know each other, which is like, okay, they're going to basically do the Vulcan mind meld, and figure each other out, and then come out of it and be like, what the hell is that? Well, why did you do that to me? And blah, 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 blah. And so that started that. But then, oh my gosh, there's a sequence in the book that's like, I want to say a whole chapter or two of just people in each other's minds. And at one point, I gave it to my husband, and I had him read it, and I said to him, is it too much people in each other's dreams? And he's like, it's maybe one too many. And I'm like, I know, but I can't figure out how to, because it was like, okay, part of it is you've got these characters who are awake, all the time.
Mhm.
And you can't just sort of skip, especially like toward the end of this book where there's a lot happening at once. You got to pass the time, and you got to have everyone finding out things about each other. And how is that going to happen? And it's like, instead of like someone discovering a letter in a trunk or something, it's they fall into someone else's mind and discover someone else in there. And so it did sort of, for plot purposes, speed things along, but also just in terms of like compression and having people who have hidden and hidden and hidden and hidden from each other, how are they going to understand each other in one quick sort of burst? It became a tool. Maybe I went back to that well one or two too many times, but it was a good way to like just sort of explode out the possibilities of, okay, how can something be suddenly demonstrably weird?
Right.
Like for there's I won't get into it because that's spoilers and whatever, but also um yeah, just it's a tool that brings a lot of understanding very quickly.
It also opens up possibilities for towards the end of the book. I thought it was just quite brilliant how it also echoes how Hava, even though things seem resolved at the end of the first book, how she can still hear the
Mhm.
scream of the wizard. And
Mhm.
so in another way, it's a metaphor for the lingering trauma. It's much more realistic about
Yeah.
how that there are these consequences. And especially with the mind meld, that also well, it's parallel with how these communities sort of come together,
Mhm.
right? And which is inevitable in New York too. And we were kind of
Yeah.
hoping for that. We can't have just these just supernatural characters intersect. We really want all the communities to come and help each other.
Mhm.
Do we have sit with questions? Is there anything else that you would like to share before I jump into questions? I was actually, quick question. I was curious about the time scale with the first book having
Oh
it
yeah.
be compressed, but with the second book, surprised by how quickly time will pass and there'll be a decade. But it also allowed you to incorporate major historical events too. And I know from your interview that you worked on this during 2020. So I was
Mhm.
very curious about how you felt working during the pandemic, where in the book it would be just a few years before the 1918 pandemic, and if you felt a kind of like
Yeah.
that we're
And
gonna.
when you do research on like World War I, and you get reason you tend to like get research in like chunks of years, and so it's like I knew of what was coming, down the pike, and I tried. There were timelines of the book that from earlier drafts that I was going to have it all the way up to. I don't think I ever actually got to the pandemic, but to like the U.S. being in World War I. When the book ends, it's still 1915, and then the U.S. hasn't entered the war yet. Um, but I knew about the pandemic, and I knew that it was, you're sort of staring down the barrel of it. Um, and here it was like, oh, it sort of what else? There were so many parallels between the early 1900s and our current time, just aside from the pandemic too, like immigration panic for one thing. Um, all the, one of the things that is in this book is a reference to the suffrage movement, and of course, Me Too is happening now, and it's like it's every you start to I start to wonder how historians don't just look around and say, you people think that like you're the first people to like ever figure this stuff out. It's like we keep coming through these cycles, and learning and mostly forgetting, and then learning and then mostly forgetting, and then it like changes slightly for whatever, for the next generation, and whatever the aspect of whatever that we're focusing on. But it's it just so much stuff just keeps coming around that it is sort of frustrating, but it also does, the other side of that is it makes it feel like it's all relevant, even though it's, stuff taking place in the 1900s. It's like workplace safety. Yeah, we're still dealing with that, like it's all, it all feels way too familiar sometimes.
Um, I don't really read much historical fiction, but a favorite teacher of mine, Peter O. Davies, who does write historical fiction, among other things, said that writing historical fiction for him is about recovering lost history or reclaiming. And for me, definitely, I read books and seen movies set during this time period, but I'd never seen anything or read anything about Little Syria. So that for me definitely broadened my understanding of the time. For you, let's see, before I jump into questions, was there anything that was most important for you to kind of recover or reclaim in writing from this period?
It's funny you mentioned that Little Syria. I mean, I got a lot of questions asking if I'd invented that. That's how little it's known. Yeah. And I'm like, no, heck no. I'm not going to invent an entire immigrant group in a city that wasn't there, unless they're magical. But yeah, I mean, and it's just not there anymore. I mean, even toward in Hidden Palace, like a bunch of the Syrian immigrants were already moving to like Brooklyn, Atlantic Avenue sort of area. But Little Syria itself, basically, like the original Little Syria, pretty much disappeared by like the 40s, I think. But now people know more about it. There's like historical societies that try to advance awareness of it. Things that I want to sort of save and preserve. I think one thing that, especially for like the Jewish Lower East Side, I came to the first book. My my understanding, my very, very limited and Hollywoodized understanding of what the Lower East Side was like was basically Funny Girl. It was a lot of like just push carts and singing and or everyone was Orthodox, I guess. And what really came out was just the sheer diversity of the population, and how every form of Judaism that we have now was back then, and down to like the very strident Jewish atheists, and there is no such thing as a monolithic population of anything, even in a community of like 10 people. It's going to be just to sort of reclaim the idea of people who lived back then were like X. No, you can't say that any more than people 100 years from now will be able to say that about us. And just to sort of own that and pay it its due is what I try to do.
Fantastic. So we've got some questions here, and some of this, let's see. This is interesting. Okay. If you had to somehow transition the story into a different time period, which would you like to explore?
Oh, goodness gracious. Oh, it gets hard because like people ask me, are you going to bring it into modern times ever? And I'm like, well, I don't, because we have like cameras now, and it's harder to hide and be, if people are going to notice if if you're the same person you were 100 years ago. Time period. I would love to do the 30s. I think, I don't know if I want to do World War II. I think that might be a little too much. I think the 60s, I think the two of them in the 60s would be fun. Would be a lot of fun. I think they would go to a few consciousness raising events. I think someone asked me once what the Jinni would think of online dating. It's like, oh my God. It's like you picture like the worst sort of like serial dater of, he's gonna have like his date that, his stock date that he takes all his women on or something.
Can just ghost in and out, right? Shape.
Exactly. Yeah.
Personality.
I think the 30s and the 60s, I think would be my the two that I'd be most interested in.
Be interested in the fashion of those two.
Yes, the fashion. Absolutely.
Let's see. Next question. Given how research oriented you are, would you ever consider writing nonfiction?
I don't think So I love the research, but I love it as like detail finding and sort of general sleuthing. I don't, I, to me, nonfiction is like a whole other world. It's like, oh, writing nonfiction, it's like, oh, then I have to like have an idea of something that no one else has realized about this thing that happened a long time ago. And I need to be able to prove it. And I need to be able to withstand, a bunch of colleagues all trying to tell me that I've got it wrong. And I just, that just, it's sort of like, I've managed to, I think, cheat a little by making it, it's like I'm a researcher, but I research for fiction, and therefore I don't have, I don't have to go through the peer review process, and I don't have to, stake tenure on anything and all of that. So I don't have to deal with like, reviews that are, I mean, fiction, there's scathing fiction reviews and then there's scathing nonfiction reviews, and it's like, oh my God. So I think I'm going to keep it in the realm of fiction for now.
Cool. This looks like a great little anecdote from Freddie Dorkin. Not a question, but a note for Helene. In the 60s, I went to Yiddish lefty shul, and Vic Fink, Janice Ian's dad, told a story in a dusty attic classroom that had a large corner fenced off about golems. And I saw the dust in the corner gathering itself and swirling into a golem. Scared the dickens out of me. Yeah.
That is awesome.
All right. Any chance you might write a third book in the series?
It's possible. It is quite possible. I do have one more book on my contract, so I must I must write a third book of something. But I have, I'm still in the recovery phase from this one. And part of anything that I would do before starting to write the next one is to figure out how not to make it take another 7 years, which I don't know. I seem to bite off big projects. I seem to like big immersive things. And as a parent who, is also doing things like swim lessons and Girl Scouts and, all of that, it can be hard to keep all of that in my head and do everything else at the same time. It might end up being a little more, I don't want to say episodic, but more plot driven than this one was, and more of like a, I would go down to maybe a year or 2 years in the span, and just have something that's a little more of a, a fast car moving from A to Z, and just get to the end of the plot, which I think could be fun. It might be fun to do a romp, but yeah, we'll see.
You seem to be very productive under high pressure. I know from interviews that for your first book, you had like a year. You just had a baby and you had a year on your contract to finish the book. And then for your second book, you chose to during a global pandemic.
Oh yeah, and especially like the part last summer where I was basically working in a tent in the backyard for 18 hours a day. That was a lot of fun, because like my husband took over all the kids stuff and the homeschooling, because we were, sort of rolling it into the new school year, and I was out there until it got to be like 100 degrees, and then the fire started and I couldn't breathe anymore, so I had to come in. So it was very much and it's one of those, another like, oh, great story now, but it was sort of hell to live through. And I just, I want to be as present as I can for like the rest of my life that isn't just these imaginary people in my head. So yeah, I am good under pressure, but it's not ideal.
Speaking of the imaginary characters in your head, someone asks if you have a dream cast to portray these imaginary characters, because I was thinking so cinematic. So much of the action set pieces were perfectly executed.
I don't know who anyone is anymore. I don't know. I feel like You know, my mom, we would go in the supermarket past the checkout aisles and look at People magazine, and she'd just go, oh, I don't know anymore who any of
Their
these
age
people.
doesn't matter, or their
Exactly.
just your dream cast. I am curious if you have.
I think Rachel Weisz would be very good as Hava. Um, for Ahmad, I think we would have to. I'm sure people out there who are much better versed in like Middle Eastern actors than I am. Um, there's when people, say who do you think would play him? There, I don't think he can act, but there's a Turkish singer named Tarkan, who had a couple of like hits a number of years ago, who's just very tall and short hair and these gorgeous eyes. Like, okay, that's I want him to look like him. I have no idea if this guy can act, but that's who I think of. Um, and yeah, I don't know who else. Oh, everyone, people better than me at figuring this stuff out would probably have a better idea.
Cool. Last question. What have you been reading recently, and do you have any recommendations?
I just started this amazing book, called Folklorn.
Oh, I heard. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
you've heard of it? Yeah, I think you've got a copy. I see it behind you. And it's actually it's very fun reading, just because, oh well, Angela knows this, but as it turns out, both of our husbands are neutrino physicists, which is a pretty bizarre and specific thing for like two husbands to be. But for people who know my work but not yours, it's you're combining, like, again, like the science and the art and the folklore into this really interesting, like getting the precision of the one, and the sometimes vagueness of the other, and the contrast between the two. I just started it, and I know it's a book I'm just gonna eat my way through. Other stuff. Oh, I am also reading the Murderbot Diaries, by Martha Wells. I've made it about I'm up to the first novel. There are a bunch of novellas. It's 4 novellas, starting with All Systems Red, and then a novel, which is Network Effect. And I've read the 4 novellas. In fact, I listened to a couple of them on audiobook, and they're great audiobooks. The problem for me for audiobooks is you get these things that are like 17 hours long, and like halfway through, I'm like, oh my God, I need to like actually read it. So like I end up like getting the book somewhere and then just like reading through the rest of it. But these are short enough that like I'm like making dinner listening to Murderbot, and it's again like it reminds me so much of Java, in a way that here you have this AI. The whole thing about Murderbot is that the protagonist is a not a robot, but sort of an AI who's for protection and security, who goes rogue and sort of achieves consciousness, and now has to decide what to do and try to fit in with humans. And so I'm reading this and I'm like, okay, this is like the far future sci-fi version of Java. So in that way, it's the Frankenstein issue. It's this thing that we've always had of what if human, but not quite. So it's just fun, the parallels.
Very cool. Yeah, I've heard great things about it. Okay. I think that's we're approaching the hour we have.
Oh my God.
Audrey.
How'd that
Yes.
Well, I'm glad you had a good time. If the hour went by that quickly. I certainly had a very good time. This is such an amazing talk. Thank you both for being here and giving us this awesome conversation, Helene, Angela. This has been really fantastic. And thank you to everyone at home who's tuning in tonight, for our authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and our incredible staff at Harvard Bookstore. Check out the link in the chat if you'd like to purchase The Hidden Palace. There's also a link in the chat for Folklorn. Support our authors. They're amazing. Both books are fantastic. Please remember to shop indie and shop local. Any final words, Helene?
No, I'm just going to say it again. Shop indie, shop local. Independent booksellers kept me going through the pandemic, and indie booksellers have been amazing to me, and I really want to return the favor. So let's keep on.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. It means a lot to us. Have a great night, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night.